I'm Judy Derricks, State Resource Conservationist for NRCS, and I just want to start out by telling you that what I'm going to do today is just very generically go over the new 590 standard. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. There needs to be additional training because there are some pieces and parts of the nutrient management plan that just simply require more attention than a quick overview that lasts only 1 hour. So I am aware of that. I also want to really compliment the SOC process and the SOC group that put this new standard together. So this standard is something that I am working with. I have not been in the process all along, so there was a lot of information that went on in communication, a lot of work behind the scenes by a whole lot of people. And I really anticipate that there will be additional training opportunities for some of those folks. The standard itself had a lot of influence from agency staff, not just NRCS, but additional agency staff, DNR, LCD, Department of Ag. Also, the University of Wisconsin had some key components as far as developing this and being on the SOC team. We also had agronomists and we had farmers. We had a large variety of people. So I do want you to know that there will be future follow-up training, but I am just going to give you a once-over and just talk about where is the new standard, what changed, and some of the background to it. So before I get started, I do want to let Twyla Kite, I know you're on, Twyla. I want to thank you because I took a couple of slides of yours because they were well done, and kind of give background of the importance and the critical need for a nutrient management standard in Wisconsin. So I want to thank you for that. And I want to thank Sue Porter because, as always, Sue likes to put together really good, clear comparisons, and I took a few of her ideas as well when I put this together. So we'll get started. The nutrient management standard was updated in, I think it finished about October of last year. It was finally posted in December because there was quite a process as far as review is concerned. So what I want to do today is just focus on some of the changes. And before I do that, I just want to talk a little bit about the significance of 590 and why it has become such an important standard for the state of Wisconsin. I don't think any of us need to be told how important nutrient balancing is in the state. We see it every day, and we have concerns every day about the need to make sure that animal agriculture is really focusing on good nutrient balancing. So a couple of things that I just wanted to point out. We know already that private wells have issues, and the general public is very concerned about nitrate levels, and oftentimes the general public looks directly at nitrates and puts that in an equivalent to the number of animal units they have in the county, and that sometimes is unfair, and we all know that because septics have a major impact as well. But nonetheless, we need to be very concerned about protecting our groundwater, and nitrate levels are not retreating, and they are a major concern in a lot of places. So we do have to be concerned about that. I was on a farm this week and they talked about, well, my nitrates are only 15. And let me tell you, if anybody's nitrates were over 10, 20 years ago, people got alarmed. So when we hear language, they're only 15, it is concerning, and we do need to be paying attention to what we're doing long-term for groundwater protection. So whatever we need to do in regards to nutrient balancing, we have to keep that in mind. Wisconsin Supreme Court, there's an article here on the fact that insurance companies are starting to kick back and say, well, maybe we're just not going to include that in general liability for insurance policies. So that's very concerning to dairies, very concerning to livestock, period. And then the one that we're all watching is the potential situation in Iowa where the waterworks plant is directly looking at 3 counties for their contribution in the river system and impact to that community water source. So a lot is going on. Don't have to talk about Wisconsin. We're all aware of some of our hot spots and some of the issues that are happening right here and now. So the significance of 590 in Wisconsin has probably never been more important than it is now. So enough of that. We can talk a little bit about the Gulf of Mexico and the hypoxia issues. I think this water picture here says a lot, but I will tell you that I've seen a same photo aerial depiction of the Mississippi River with contributions to states. So it isn't just Iowa contributing or Illinois or Ohio, but it's all of us, and we need to be concerned because it's pretty visible at times. So again, these are the top nitrogen contributors, and all eyes are on parts and pieces of Wisconsin for that hypoxia issue in the Gulf of Mexico. So enough background there. I just wanted to share that with you. And then I want to talk a little bit about nutrient management and practice standards in general. I am responsible for keeping the standards, the non-engineering standards here in Madison. So even though they're posted to the NRCS website, there are a lot of team players. There's a lot of people depending upon practice standards. Our practice standards come to us from national, and some of the things that you see here we do not get to change. One is the definition. The definition of the new 590 has not changed from the old 590. The definition of nutrient management is managing the amount, the rate, the source, the placement, the method of application, and the timing of plant nutrients and soil amendments. And that has not changed. And you will see the purpose of it again is to budget, supply and conserve nutrients for plant production, and minimize the risk of ag non-point source pollution to surface and groundwater sources, groundwater resources. So none of that has changed. So we keep moving on. So what has been going on? Our national standard comes to us with basic minimums that are expected for us to apply here in state. The national standards, just to give you a little history, they talk about NPK balance and making sure that we're accommodating all sources of NPK and budgeting for them. They look at nutrient risk assessments. We need to be focused on N&P risk assessments. We need to make sure that we have identified setbacks within our state, and we need UW land-grant university specifications to be followed for soil testing, nutrient balancing, manure crediting for soil, pH and for tissue sampling. So that is why that's part of the national standard that we will use, UW recommendations, which is what we have always done, and that's for very good reason. No surface application if off-site losses are likely. So in our national standard it says you simply cannot apply on frozen or snow-covered ground. That's how it's worded, and then if you have to, there are exceptions, and the exceptions for applying on frozen and snow-covered ground or saturated soils as well, the exceptions have got to be measured and in place, and those exceptions to allow for the winter spreading and the spreading on other conditions, factors have to be addressing the slope, the residue, the living covers, and the nutrients applied, and you have to identify setbacks. So the national standard has spoken as to what has to be in our standard, and from there we need to get it specific to Wisconsin, which is what the new standard and the old standards have always tried to accommodate. So now I'm going to get into some of the more specifics, and now I'm dealing with the new practice standard itself. So those of you that have heard me talk in the past recognize that I quickly turn you to the plans and specifications section of any practice standard, because that is the section that tells you what I have to document in order to address this practice standard. So sometimes what I like to do is just use that as my overall summary. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to make a quick comparison to the current new standard that was posted in December of 2015 against the one that was posted in 2005. So the plans and specs section gave me that summary. So I'm going to go through it. This is the new plans and specs system or section. And what I will tell you is if there is a red asterisk at the beginning of it, that means that was also addressed in the 2005 version. So you will start to see where the changes have occurred just looking at plans and specs 2005 versus 2015. So the first thing the plans and specs requires in order to have a legitimate 590 plan is that we have site maps. And the site maps we've talked about in the past need to have track, field numbers, field boundaries, and acres. And they need to include soil maps. That's not changed. That's still part of our plans and specs. The restriction maps have been required as well. And we need to be looking at concentrated flow patterns. We need to be looking at surface water, wetlands, and we need to be looking at fields above T. And I know there's a lot of concern that how come fields above T? That has not changed. That's always been part of the standard. And the reason for that is anything that is eroding above tolerable soil loss is also potentially a serious risk for nutrient runoff, which is why we focused on making sure that our fields are at a tolerable soil loss level. And if not, then we don't consider them to be able to handle manure applications, and that has not changed. Conduits to groundwater. We've always been looking at conduits to groundwater. So we're looking at wells, sinkholes. Swallowts is a new identified risk. It's always been a risk, but we've actually put that one in specific. Fractured bedrocks has been there. We've always looked at mines. We've looked at tile inlets, but this time there's a lot of language in the new standard about tile inlets and what we need to be looking at there. Quarries, depressional recharge areas, all of that those issues have been identified in the past, so none of that should be new or surprising to anyone. The spreading restrictions have always been there, but they have changed slightly this time. For winter spreading in the past, we looked at, I believe it was 12%. Now, anything over 6% needs to be restricted, which means you cannot apply manure on anything over 6% slope unless you take into consideration the mitigations that we need to assure that we likely will not have the runoff in the spring that we could anticipate. So I'm going to say that a different way, because I know a lot of people are thinking the new 590 doesn't allow winter spreading. It does allow exceptions to not winter spreading. And in Wisconsin, we've identified 6% slope as our cutoff. So if it's over 6%, we cannot winter spread unless we have assurances in a mitigation plan that we likely have taken care of the risks associated with those slopes. So in essence, we've really kind of taken that 12% and adjusted that, and it is now 6%, but I will talk a lot today about the mitigations. So please hear me say again that you can winter spread in Wisconsin. So it is not prohibited. We do have mitigations designed that will allow for winter spreading. The mitigations are fairly easy to accommodate, and we will go into those next. Surface water quality management areas, the SWGMAs, the DNR well compensation sites. That's new this time. The DNR well compensation sites are those that got paid for contaminated wells that were traced back to animals. And the Silurian dolomite soils have restriction on them now. Those have been identified, and then we've always allowed for other sites identified by local governments. So those are the changes to the spreading restrictions, but we have always had spreading restrictions. So I'm going to talk quite a bit, which is why it's in blue, about runoff mitigation required by field number, because that's new. And that's where we're just going to say these are the exceptions that allow you to do that winter spreading if you're on a slope over 6%. So we'll talk quite a bit about that today. Nitrogen restrictions, we've always had N, P, R, and W restrictions. There are some definitions that you should pay attention to. For nitrogen restrictions, it's 5 feet or less over bedrock, and potable wells, it's 1,000 feet of community potable wells. Concentrated flow channels, we've always had to have those identified. That's also part of the plans and specs. And we'll just move on here. Oops. Make sure I'm doing this, yeah. All right. Then the next page here, each field's tolerable and current soil loss, that was always part of the practice standard. Soil, plant, manure, and organic matter products, and any tests have to meet UW-REX, that's not new. Planned realistic crop yields, that's not new either. Nutrient application rates and actual applications included, including the rates, the form, the timing, and method, that's the definition of the practice standard, and that's the same. There update changes in crops, yields, tillage, soil, or manure analysis. So anytime that that those change, they need to be reflected in the nutrient management plan. Stacking capacity and storage capacity is factored into every nutrient management plan as part of the balancing, and it talks specifically and defines some of that stacking capacity in this standard a little better than it has in the past. And then there are weather conditions for nitrogen applications. This was referenced in the past, but now it's kind of spelled out where you really do have to identify what were those conditions. In other words, we wanted to make sure that you were clear for an application. You're not out there 2 minutes before a rain event. So there's some identification of the weather conditions. What are the soil conditions on the site? What are the crop growth stages? Photographs, soil tests, tissue testing has been part of the standard in the past. Canopy sensing and other nitrogen models. So those have been part of it, and those are spelled out a little bit more in this practice standard. Guidance and record keeping has been there all along, and SNAP Plus takes care of most of that for us. Soil test, parts per million, P-balance, P-index, those are part of the standards and have been. There have been pieces and parts of that that are better, are a little more spelled out, which help, and also in the nitrogen application. A lot of it has been clarified, but they've always been part of the standard. Management activities required and related narrative, that's something we've always also put in the plans. Tile inlets, outlets, depth of drainage system for liquid manure. That has been spelled out quite a bit in the new standard, and that's because we've had a lot of serious events in the past 10 years, and that they spent quite a bit of time. The team put a lot of energy into making sure that we did a much better job of defining what it is we need to do to protect ourselves from tile, potentially contaminations from tiles. Emergency response actions have always been important in nutrient management. They're critical in CNMPs, and now we talk about them here in the 590 plan, because that all good planning can go astray with one emergency. So that's now spelled out in the 590. Plans shall meet permit requirements, tech regs requirements, and follow NRCS policy and guidelines as found in the General Manual and National Planning Procedures Handbook. That is in both standards, the old one and the new one. So that also has not changed. But you will hear more about what all that means in the new as we go forward. But that's always been part of the plan as well. Winter spreading plans, they have to include the storage capacity for each manure type, and implementation maps for winter spreading that meet the restrictions for frozen or snow-covered soils. And what is new in this standard is mitigation practices that have to be identified for each field. And the reason it's for each field is that each field may have a different mitigation need and a different mitigation plan. So we need to separate those out field by field, the decisions that are being made on the conservation planning side of this. So again, the winter spreading plan has been included in the past, but now with the new standard, we have to step it up and define what it is we're going to do to allow us to reduce the risks associated with winter spreading, and winter spreading is still defined as frozen or snow-covered ground. Okay. So what we want to look at here is what has stayed the same in regards to nutrient management, and the things that have definitely stayed the same are that we have to keep erosion in check, that we have to do our nutrient balances with all inputs associated, and that we have to look at risks and assess all risks on a field-by-field basis. And the risks include surface and groundwater, runoff, and the same as they always have, just planning decisions that we need to be concerned with. What has not changed also are the facts that we will be using UW recommendations for soil tests and for tissue tests and for manure sampling and for fertilizer application rates that will accommodate all inputs. There will be slight interpretations where we have added more explanation as far as those recommendations, but overall, the fact that we need to be following UW recommendations, nothing has changed between the two standards on that one. We've just made sure everybody understands a little more about what those recommendations really mean. So you will see some differences, and that's because we spelled out some things to make it a little more clear. All right. We also need to do on-site evaluations in making nutrient recommendations, and we have to rely on those on-site evaluations when we define risk assessment maps. That has not changed, but you hear more emphasis and more explanation as to what we expect to find on that. And you would expect that we will step that up a little bit because we are, after all, it's been a long time since we've updated the practice standard, and we've learned a lot since 2005. So those changes in some of the risks that we've encountered over the last 10 or 15 years absolutely need to be discussed in the new standard. So that will be happening as well. So in summary, we're lucky we've got a lot of assistance from the university to help us with our balancing. And again, we're still relying on all of this information when it comes to the nutrient balancing and the manure management. So all of that is still good. And again, in summary, we really do need to pay attention to the risks. And here are some of the tools that we did not have in 2005 that are pretty exciting now. So we actually have runoff risk assessment maps that tie into the forecast. And those are available to help landowners make sure if they document if it looked like it was supposed to be a good day to be applying manure and you get some weird rain event, at least you've got a document that said, I didn't do it deliberately and it wasn't supposed to rain, and the map tells me it wasn't supposed to rain. So there's a lot of tools available now that weren't there in the past to help us make sure that we are paying attention to potential risks from serious runoff events, and weather mapping is one of them. Whether the maps hit it right or not is another story, but at least we've got predictable tools available to us. In addition to that, I just want to really commend the UW and the Department of Ag for some of the tools that they've put together to help also. And this one, obviously, we all really appreciate, and that's the mapping that is available to help us assess those nutrient risks. So we've got a lot of maps. It'll keep us square on potential wells if they're identified and they can see them. It keeps us square on surface water. Potential other risk issues are easy to identify. The only thing that we have to be aware of is that's as good as the map itself, and this is an incredible tool, but when we are out doing assessments and we see something that wasn't identified, then we need to make sure we incorporate that and make the adjustment to the map to incorporate any risks on site that may not have been picked up in the mapping process. It's entirely possible that something gets missed, and so we always want to make sure that we're thinking on-site risks and getting the landowner to pay attention to that as well, because it's as much their responsibility as any of ours to make sure that they understand just because it isn't on a map doesn't mean they shouldn't be paying attention to it. If they know it's there, we need to accommodate it. Okay, so we've got a lot of good things going for us. So what I want to do now is kind of zoom into much more specifics, and these are some of the changes that you need to be aware of. So liquid manure, and this, oops, I think I kind of got this out of order here, but this is no applied liquid manure can be done February through March in areas where the DNR well compensation funds identified contaminated wells. So that's something that we brought forward just as an accommodation. If we've already had well contamination, we know that can be repeated. So to protect ourselves from those absolutely obvious sites, there can be no liquid manure applied February through March in those sites. The same is true with the Silurian dolomite. I mentioned this, but it's listed here on this. If we've got the Silurian dolomite within 60 inches of the soil surface, we will not be authorizing liquid manure applications February through March on those sites. So alternative sites will have to be found. Those are off limits. And we also have 300 feet direct conduits to groundwater have to be protected from liquid manure. And there are mitigation options that are required for areas, and those mitigation options have to be accommodated if you're in a swigma, if you're on frozen and snow-covered ground that is over 6% slope, if you have subsurface drainage concerns, if you identify ephemeral erosion issues. And one thing I do want to caution you is if you've got a lot of ephemeral erosion issues going on, you've got to ask yourself, are they really following their conservation plan, and is it at tolerable limits? So anytime I see ephemeral erosion issues, I'm suspect of the nutrient management, or excuse me, of the conservation plan. So this one is in there just as a precautionary, because we shouldn't be seeing ephemeral erosion if we're at tolerable limits. But on occasion you get rain events that cause that. So what we're saying here is if we've got ephemerals, we're going to have to mitigate. Air quality concerns, if you are concerned about particulates, odors, nitrogen emissions. So these 5 are all require mitigation options. And again, we are going to get to what a mitigation is eventually here. So, for example, if you cannot meet the 6% slope, you absolutely cannot do your winter, you don't have enough under 6% slope to take care of your manure over the winter, or you're in a swigma and it's over 6%, or you're in ephemeral erosion, and you have to mitigate in order to meet this. Now we're going to get into what does that mean. manure on fields where concentrated flow is present, for example. Let's say you need to put some manure out there. So here are where we get into the mitigation, and this is some of the options. You have to pick 2 of these to assure yourself that you've done what you can to reduce the risks associated with runoff on concentrated flow areas. Number 1, you can pick contour strips or contour buffer strips. If you need to know what a buffer strip is, the practice standard for buffer strips is up to date or will be shortly. Buffer strips are a minimum of 14 feet of grass on the length of slope, and contour strips are the same size field where you have alternating strips of grass. So buffer strips are grass, but they're smaller strips than a contour strip. But either one works and is part of a mitigation process. Leaving all crop residue, meaning no silage, no bedding, and no fall tillage, is one other opportunity to mitigate, to slow water down, and to prevent runoff. Intermittent strips of manure, no more than half of the field covered. So in other words, you put your application in, 50% of it is you're not applying the entire field, but only half the field, and you're leaving strips in between each application is an option. Applying no more than 25% of the field at each application and then waiting 14 days between application. In other words, you're alternating your field as you're applying, is a mitigation. Limit application to 3,500 gallons or 30 pounds of phosphate, whichever, or potash, whichever is, phosphate, whichever is less. So you pick the gallons or the 30 pounds, whatever one you want to do. No application within 200 feet of a flow channel is also a mitigation, so backing out from your waterways. Fall tillage on the contour and slopes that are less than 6% are all other options that you can pick. So picking 2 of these equals a mitigation plan for the field. And then we go to the SWGMA restriction areas. And for the SWGMAs, installation and maintaining a permanent vegetative buffer, we have a 393 standard, is an option. Vegetated cover or 30% residue after manure application. Incorporate within 72 hours and a tolerable soil loss following the incorporation. Establish a crop or a cover crop promptly after applying manure. Apply nutrients within 7 days of planting on the continuous no-till system. So those are all the SWGMA restrictions that you can consider. SWGMA or subsurface drainage, where you want to apply under 11% dry matter manure. Limit the application to 12,000 gallons per acre. No application on saturated soils, that's for all. No ponding is ever allowed with liquid manure. And then we need to monitor our outlets. And we're talking tile outlets. And if we have issues with tile outlets, there's a lot of information in the new practice standards on how to identify tile inlets and outlets, and then what to do in case, what it means to monitor them. And we need to routinely monitor them, but worse yet, if we see that we've got an issue, then there's some guidance on what to do about that. Okay. I'm still going to hold the questions here until the end, I think, but I'm checking that. All right, so we'll just keep going here. Changes in winter spreading for 2015, and I think this is the one area that has the most curiosity and the most concern over what can we and can't we do here in Wisconsin with the new practice standards. So I'm just going to lay it out there. Winter spreading means on frozen or snow-covered ground, which is exactly what it always has meant. So if you're going to spread, and if it's over 6%, there are some things that you need to pay attention to. No nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer can be applied on frozen ground except for pastures and grass or small grains. So we need to recognize that no matter what, we're not going to be applying fertilizer on frozen ground. So that has been spelled out in the new practice standard. The new practice standard talks about the requirements of storage if you don't have a workable winter spreading plan, which is why I say you absolutely have to have a workable spreading plan, or you're not allowed to be spreading manure in the winter any longer. So that's part of the new standard. So we need to make sure that we are able to get a workable winter spreading plan, or we will be forcing consideration to storage. And then we also have one restriction, a new restriction, which is phosphorus is restricted to 7,000 gallons of liquid manure or 60 pounds PTO5 rates. So those are phosphorus restrictions on winter frozen ground. So then we go to the mitigation. So if we have to do something because we don't have a storage and we don't have a 6% safe place to be winter spreading, then here are the other options that exist, and you need to be picking 2 of these mitigations in order to do the winter spreading option. Option number 1, contour buffers, contour strip cropping. Option number 2, leave all the crop residue and do not fall tillage. So these mitigations are starting to sound very similar. But this again is the winter spreading mitigation plan. Apply the manure in intermittent strips and cover no more than half of the field at once, and the strips are alternating. So you're applying and then skipping and applying and skipping, so you get 50% coverage. Apply manure on no more than a quarter of the field during each application, and then waiting 14 days in between for each field application. So you're moving the manure around field to field and giving time in between. Reduce manure application rate to 3,500 gallons or 30 pounds of PTO5, whichever is less. So those are the choices for mitigation on winter spreading ground. Additional groundwater protection. This is some things to consider for groundwater protection is late summer or fall applications must follow 2809 for all nitrogen sources, and 590 requirements for sites with permeable, with bedrock issues, or with high water tables. And I do want to pay attention here that bedrock is defined as less than 20 inches to bedrock and less than 12 inches to apparent water table. So those are things that we have to pay attention to with groundwater protection. No commercial nitrogen on soils with 5 feet or less to bedrock, or that have permeability issues, that have bedrock issues, or are wetlands or water issues, and within 1,000 feet of community potable wells. Exception would be fall seeded crops or blended fertilizers that are part of A 2809. So the nitrogen rates shall not exceed 36 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So and additional groundwater protection that's been identified here, not over 120 pounds of available nitrogen per acre on high permeable soils or bedrock identified soils, the use of nitrogen inhibitors, cover crops, overwintering annuals, perennial crops, covers established within 14 days of application, surface apply and do not incorporate for 3 days, and watch the soil temperatures to make sure they're below 50 degrees, or it is after October 1st. So, all right, and that ends the slides that I have, and we've taken about 45 minutes, and so I do see that there is one question, and we will see what that question is. Can you make me the presenter? I'm sorry, I don't even know who you are, so I'm not very good at this. I guess I can't make you the presenter, but I would be more than happy to let you be the presenter.
Yeah. Hey, Judy, this is Penny.
Yes?
And that's just
Hi,
some fluke or something that happens.
Is that you?
So it means nothing. We don't, yeah. So
hey,
no one else wants to be, because the first time I think I tried to make them the presenter, and then that's, no. So just ignore that question.
We have trouble with that? Okay.
Yes.
I'm thinking,
Continue on.
All right, so I'm open for whatever questions anybody might have here. And again, you might stump me because there is a lot in this practice standard, and it does take a lot to dissect it. And I do know that I probably do need to put some charts together to make it a little bit easier to absorb. But what I tried to do today is I tried to feed you the changes and show you what mitigation means and assure you that this is very doable. And what I have not mentioned is that there was a lot of public support for the nutrient management standard because it did a good job of trying to capture closer some of the concerns that are out there for surface and groundwater, which we absolutely have to be focused on. And at the same time, it allowed us to step up conservation efforts to do a better job of protecting our water sources and yet allow nutrients to be applied to the ag lands. Right, I do have a question. Could we please get a copy of the PowerPoint? You absolutely can get a copy of the PowerPoint, and it will be, I'll let Penny answer that one. How about that?
Hi, Kirsty.
I need to get you a copy first, Penny.
Yes, and we can share that with you, Kirsty, and then we'll also have the presentation posted on our website, you know, within a few weeks or so, and then we can let you know when that goes on too, okay?
Good, thank you. And Shannon, I absolutely can, I will choose not to address the state administrative rule. You will have to, you will need to talk to Sarah Wallen over at Department of Ag or talk to DNR about, I'm not the person that needs to address where that is at as far as the stage is concerned, so I'm unfortunately not going to answer that one because if I did, I wouldn't give you a very good answer anyway. So I know they're very much working on that process, so you need to connect with your DNR and your Department of Ag folks to figure out exactly where things are at, unless one of them happens to be on, which I'm not sure. So sorry about that. Okay, anybody else? Okay. Well, as always, just to let you know, Section 4, the Field Office Tech Guide, has the old standard posted, and the reason the old standard remains posted is because that's still used by state agencies until they do go through the process of hearing and they incorporate it. So we keep the old one there for state purposes, and also it is also important for NRCS as well because we have a lot of contracts still linked to the old standard. The new standard is posted, and so feel free to look at that and make sure you understand if you are working with NRCS programs, you need to stay to the current standard for anybody that has new cost sharing follows the standard that's currently posted, and for our purposes the new standard is the one that we are officially endorsing at this point. Okay, I really appreciate your time today. I hope that this was helpful. I recognize we need more of this. So again, thank you very much for your time today. And special thanks, Penny, for you hosting this and posting it.
You're welcome, Judy, and thanks so much for doing the presentation. It was great. And I would also like to mention that this webinar is being provided in part by the State Interagency Training Committee. And I think that's about it. And we will get this posted. And if you have any other questions, please let us know. Have a great day, everyone.